Afternoon. I'm a little confused on what time it is. I flew in from Scotland last night, and so I was up at 5:30 this morning, which if anyone knew me, you would say I would never be up at 5:30 in the morning. I'm somewhat known to be a night person, but I'm a little mixed up right now. I'm super excited to be here today to talk with you guys about this topic. You already got that intro. What we're going to cover today is sort of three big things. What you should know about traditional performance management, how we can start to rethink it, and how you can engage in a process to redesign and reboot your approach to performance management. So let me start by telling you a little bit of history of how I got into this and sort of the history of this topic. So back early in like 2011, 2012, there was starting to be these whispers. This isn't working. Performance management isn't working. And it was kind of particularly around HR professionals, it was really a whisper. And if you started to tune into that, over the time, it really went from a whisper to a roar. And I would say like in 2015, 2016, you could hardly boot up your computer without some article about performance management rolling into your inbox. And Josh Burson at that time said, it's the big trend for 2015 and 2016, everybody's gonna change performance management. So if you're sitting there thinking, we haven't done this yet, fear not, you are not alone. Because as I've been looking at it, what we've found is while there's been a lot of chatter and a lot of conversation, not that many people have completely tackled this problem yet. And in fact, in the data that I'm collecting, it still says about 70% of organizations or more are looking for an opportunity to reboot performance management. Now, this is data I collect as I go around the world and speak, and I've got some cards that were set out that if you're interested in sharing your status with us, that would be great because we add it to this data and continue to update it and see sort of what the trends are in this space. So from my own personal history, what happened was back before I launched People Firm, I was the chief people officer for Hitachi Consulting. And at that time, we kind of started with a blank sheet of paper, and we designed almost all of our new talent and HR processes from scratch. And so I designed a performance management process that had a lot of nice features to it, but really still looked very traditional. And we rolled that out, and that, it worked pretty well we built a really robust capability model and some different things that were really, really great, but yet we were still dogged with a lot of the experiences that we have with traditional performance management. So fast forward later, I was sitting at my desk at People Firm, which is not a very rare occurrence, and I happened to pick up the phone as it rang, and it was at that time the CHRO at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it was my friend James. He said, hey, Tamra, I have a little project for you. I said, okay. He said, I want you to write us a white paper on performance management. And I thought, okay, James, tell me more about this. He said, well, we're getting ready to redesign our process here at the Gates Foundation. And we just want to have kind of a good history of why we're here, what's working, what's not working. But the most important thing we want to know is how is performance management driving performance? That was his key question. And he said, now remember, our executives are all PhDs and scientists, and they need it to be short and fast and to the point and research-based. So off we set to write a white paper. This isn't something we do very often, but I was really intrigued by the topic and by where the foundation was going. So we started to write the paper. And what we learned at that point was there was a lot wrong with performance management. And that sort of set us on our journey to start to figure out how we can fix it. Now, if you are sitting there and you haven't started yet to change anything, to modernize your performance management process, as I said, you're not alone. And in addition to understanding where people are, we've also been gathering data about, well, why haven't they moved forward? Any guesses on why people have been reluctant to change? Huh? Time, yeah. Takes a lot of time to do it right. Yeah, it's a big investment for sure. Ambivalence, that's a good one. Well, the number one reason is rewards without ratings. People are stymied to figure out, how am I going to calculate salary and benefits and bonus if I don't have a number system to work with? That's number one. Number two is manager trust. Anybody have this issue? Yeah, this is the whole statement is, I don't trust our managers to do this process right. So we've put all this structure around it to try to manage our managers. That's number 2. Number 3 is sort of to your ambivalence point. It's we just can't get our leaders to move forward. They may not like it, but they can't imagine something different. It's what they grew up with. And those are the top 3 things that are really holding people back. Do these resonate with you guys at all? Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about how we can move forward. So hopefully I can give you some energy, some momentum, some ideas that might help you sort of bust through some of those barriers, some of those concerns, and move forward. So as I said, we're going to talk about what we know about traditional performance management. We're going to talk about rethinking it, how we can start to shift our thinking to more modern approaches, and then sort of how we get at it. How do we start to redesign and reboot it? So what we know about traditional performance management. It's a common approach that is universally hated. It's hated by everybody. It's hated by employees, it's hated by executives, it's hated by managers. Nobody likes this process. In fact, a few years ago, I was at the Global SHRM conference, really early days, and I gave this presentation, early version of it, and I put up this slide, and I said, hey, anybody who loves performance management, please stand up. This was a crowd of about 1,400 people. Any ideas how many people stood up? 2, you were right. 2 people stood up. And I really encouraged, I was like, come on, it's okay, stand up. 2 people stood up. Now the best part about this story is afterwards I was standing up front and people come up and talk, and this guy came up and he goes, hey Tamra, I just wanted to let you know, I stood up because we don't have a performance management process. So universally hated. But the interesting thing is when I first started doing the research in this, one of the things I had to get my head really clear about is what are we trying to accomplish? I'm an engineer by training. I have to have really clear goals, frameworks. So what is the framework that we're operating in? And here's what we figured out, that we're really trying to achieve 3 goals. I don't care who you are, you're trying to achieve these 3 goals. You're trying to develop people, right? How do we grow them? How do we help them thrive? How do we build our next leaders? How do we advance them through the organization? You're trying to reward equitably, not equally, equitably. Are we paying people what they're worth? Are we, and I see you guys I will share these slides with you. You can have all this content, so you guys can let me know how to get that out, but we'll make sure you get all these slides. So we need to reward equitably, pay for those contributions that people are making, and we need to drive organizational performance. I'd say this is kind of the new kid on the block. This is the one that says, look, hey, if we're all going this way in strategy, how do we ensure that everybody in the organization is rowing the boat the same way? So those are the 3 common things, 3 common goals we're trying to do with performance management. Well, my grandma Edna, she would have said, well, bless its heart. Because when we look at traditional performance management, it's not really doing any of those things. And the data just continues to roll in and over time, over that early days that I started, the data just keeps getting worse as more people are willing to fess up how they don't trust this process, how they don't think it actually reflects performance, and the challenges that we see with it. So bless its heart. So if we're going to fix it, the first thing we have to do is understand what's broken. What is it that we've been doing? Because we have all the best intents. When I designed that process for Hitachi, I had all the best intent. But what is it that we're doing that isn't working? So let's start there. I call them the 8 fatal flaws. So fatal flaw number 1, a theory without evidence is, well, a bad theory. So remember that question that James asked me? Tamra, how does performance management drive performance? Now, as we would float drafts of our white paper over to the foundation, the team would call us up and say, you still haven't answered the question. And we would say, we're having a hard time answering that question. It really was difficult to try to get to the bottom of it. But here's what we finally concluded. What we know, and you can say, hopefully you all agree with me, engagement drives performance, right? It's been proven, it's causal. Gallup has buckets of data to share with us on that topic. So if engagement drives performance, then we could say, if performance management drives engagement, then we can drive performance. Yeah? How many of you think your performance management process drives engagement? Some, maybe, few? Okay, great. Some, good. The problem is most of the time, our traditional performance management process is driving disengagement. So we couldn't actually make the case that it's driving performance. We saw more often it was causing that issue. It was disconnecting people. It was leaving a bad taste in people's mouths. We're working with a gaming company in Seattle that when we first started working with them, they said we go into a depression for a month after our performance manager reviews, and then we sort of come back out. Well, that's a horrible place to be, right? So a theory without evidence is just a bad theory. Number 2, nobody opens up with the person who's going to poke you in the eye. So this is all about that, annual review. We pack everything into this big meeting, this annual review. The employee suits up because they know what comes out of this conversation is going to drive their compensation, their promotion opportunities, maybe their next project, all those types of things. The manager suits up because they're trying to manage their budget. They've got expectations to manage. They've got their own agenda. So what happens? A very negotiated conversation. It's not a growth conversation. It's not a transparent and open and collaborative conversation. It's a negotiation, trying to determine an outcome that both parties have some kind of stake in. So that's another problem. Fatal flaw number 3, nobody remembers the good work. Here's the challenge with us humans, and this goes back to our Neanderthal days when we were running from saber-toothed tigers. We are tilted towards the negative. We remember the negative. The half-life of the negative things that happen to us is really long compared to the positive. Even if you go into a review and you share 5 positives and 1 negative, the only thing that person's going to remember is the negative when they walk out. The positives dissipate like that. Even in the English language, 65% of our descriptor words are negative versus positive. The challenge is too often through this process, that's what gets reflected, rather the positive and the beneficial things that are going on. Flaw number 4, no man or woman is an island. This is the issue that we try to rate or assess an individual who is sitting within a very complex system. And as we try to do that, we try to ignore the system factors and somehow isolate the performance of that individual, which is completely impossible to do. So have you ever experienced this? I have. Have you ever worked in an organization where you just felt like you couldn't succeed? I did a year at Microsoft. I thought I became the dumbest person I'd ever been in my life. I thought, how did this happen? It was the system around me. It just didn't work for me. And research supports this. You can take individuals who are high performing in one team or organization, move them to another, and they are no longer a high performing person. It was nearly the system around them that helped them to perform at that level. So that's another challenge we have. Fatal flaw number 5, we are not machines. This gets into the issue with ratings. And I know we all have this love for ratings, particularly if you come from an engineering organization or something like that. We all think we can rate the other person. The truth is we can't. It's a fallacy. We're kidding ourselves. There's this thing called the idiosyncratic effect. Anyone heard of the idiosyncratic effect? Okay, so what that says is if I was to rate you, let's say I gave you a 3.4. Don't even get me started on decimals, but let's say that's what I gave you, 3.4. The truth is that rating is about 65% about me. It's my scale. It's what I think you should have done. It's how I see the world. In the end, once you throw error in, it's about 20% about you. So we're giving people these ratings that really do not have a lot of basis. And then we're trying to do that across diverse roles within an organization and say that all these people are playing these different roles, they're all 4s. And say somehow we were able to come up with that number. The truth is about performance, we can tell really high performance, we can tell really low performance. We really can't differentiate in the middle. The whole bell curve is a fallacy. And the problem is we spend most of our time, tell me if I'm right, arguing over the 3s and 4s, arguing over the middle, that we really can't differentiate. We'd be far better off to think about those high performers, address the people who are struggling, and just keep moving with the folks in the middle. Then the problem is we take all those numbers and we dump them into our spreadsheets, and we crank our big crank, and out of it we make all sorts of talent decisions. Who we promote, how we're gonna pay, all those types of things. So it's that old adage, garbage in, garbage out. If we can't trust the ratings, how are we trusting the decisions we're making around talent? And this is where you also get in those situations. I bet you've seen this, where managers try to manipulate the number because they know how it will impact. I need this person to be promoted. I need this person to have this kind of salary. They're trying to manipulate it. So it's ruining the whole process because everyone's just trying to get to a particular outcome, where they're really focused. They've completely lost those 3 goals, right, that we started with. Fatal flaw number 7, let me introduce you to the competition. Now play nice. So this is this weirdness that we've created where we want innovation, we want collaboration, we want teamwork, and yet many of us are still operating with a performance management process that's pitting people against each other. So we're trying to say, work with that person, but then at the end of the year, we're going to compare you to how you did. We're talking out both sides of our mouths. We really need to start to think about what does collaboration look like and how do we incent that within the organization. And then lastly, Pavlov's dog. Pay for performance does not deliver improved performance. Now here, I'm poking at the idea of pay for performance. If you look at the true definition of what we meant when we invented this idea of pay for performance, it's a good concept. It's differentiation that we're really recognizing. But I will tell you, almost every organization I go into who says they're a pay for performance organization, once you actually look at the differentiation across merit, it's pretty meaningless. It's tiny percentages. In the end, it's $25 or $50 in a person's paycheck in a month or biweekly or whatever. It's really not meaningful. The other problem is we put way too much focus on this compensation when what we know for most people at a certain economic level, it's the intrinsic rewards that drive their engagement, it's not the extrinsic. Pay and all that is funky stuff because it has to feel equitable, it has to feel fair. You have to have that platform, but above that, it's the intrinsic rewards that's going to drive behavior. If you don't have fairness, then you've got other problems. But we really need to kind of break it down and think about rewards in a really different way in order to drive human motivation in the ways that we want within our organizations. Okay, so when I was doing the research for the book, we'd created all of our fatal flaws, and we got towards the end, and then I found this quote from Dr. Deming. This wasn't in the 50s, but any guess when he wrote this? Anybody guess? It was the 80s, early 80s. But here's what he said. The performance appraisal nourishes short-term performance, annihilates long-term planning, builds fear, demolishes teamwork, nourishes rivalry and politics. It leaves people bitter, crushed, bruised, battered, desolate, despondent, dejected, feeling inferior, some depressed, unfit for work for weeks after receipt of a rating, unable to comprehend why they are inferior. It is unfair as it ascribes to people in a group differences that may be caused totally by the systems that they work in. He wrote that in the 82, I think it was. And it has all 8 fatal flaws in one paragraph. I was like, darn him, got it all. But I use this a lot when I work with executives because he was such a respected thought leader in this space, and look how far ahead of us he really was. So those are the 8 fatal flaws. So that's the stuff when we think about it that we want to move away from. How do we start to design systems that we don't replicate those challenges? But then the next question is, well, what do we need to move to? How do we start to rethink performance management in a way that creates the type of engagement and the kind of outcomes that we're looking for? So let's talk a little bit about that. And of course, you have to have symmetry. So if I have 8 flaws, I have 8 fundamental shifts. And here's what those are. Fundamental shift number 1 is open the door. This is really about creating transparency in this process. So I'm going to talk in a little while about this process that we do where we build design principles when we do this work with clients. And we started to go back and look at the design principles that we've created. And we usually do surveys with large numbers of people representing the organization and ask them, of the design outcomes that you want, what is top? And I will tell you, trust and transparency almost always comes out as the number 1 design principle that your employees want. They want to trust the system. They want to understand it. They want transparency. So we really need to move away from this sort of opaque, I'm not really sure where that rating came from, kind of process to something that's much more transparent and much more open. So what does that look like? It can happen a lot of different ways. Something very simple is starting to move away from just an individual manager, employee setting goals and kind of thinking about what their focus is to something that's much more around the team and sharing my goals with the team and having a lot more transparency about what we're all working on together and how we can help each other. It's a simple way to open up some conversation. Managers select people for movements versus making something far more open. I find a mix of this within organizations. Some are very transparent and post positions and everybody gets a fair shot. Some of it's very back office, positions are selected. People aren't really understanding what the opportunities are, or how they can have more mobility within the organization. And then number 3 is back to rewards, this idea of can we become more transparent with salaries, bonus, profit sharing, and that kind of thing. And really thinking about what elements would you be comfortable sharing that would start to take away some of the mystery around rewards within your organization. I've thrown this slide in here because I really like it. This is from PayScale, and they really have this spectrum that they talk about around pay transparency from the what to the woe. And what I find is organizations are in different places of where they want to share. But I think there's a lot to kind of consume here and start thinking about what is your organization culturally comfortable with around transparency. And I noticed there's a session this afternoon that's on that topic, so I'm sure you guys will talk more about it then. Fundamental shift number 2 is this idea of give the steering wheel to your employees. Really make this an employee-empowered process. Move it away from the managers run the process to the employees run the process. Because here's the thing. It's their career. They're the ones who want to have the voice that gives them a chance to say where they want to go, how fast they want to go, what types of experiences they're looking for. And you know what? When you open it up, it's not that scary. When you start to give people that power, they engage in it in a way, and they don't really have expectations that are that ridiculous. So my colleague Laura Graylish always says, nothing about me without me. I really like that. Nothing about me without me. How do you include the employees in this process in a much more way that they feel like they own it, they have that transparency, and they can really drive it? One of the ways that we're doing that is really trying to expose, if you will, a lot more of the information and put a lot more of the power in the hands of the employees through different tools. What are the open positions? What kind of capabilities do I need to move from this position to that position? What are the needs of the organization, and how can I ready myself to support those? And so we really like this simple map tool that looks at mastery, passion, and alignment, and really helps employees start to understand, how can I be in the middle? How can I create the career best experience for me, given what the organization needs and what my passion is, and my skills and capabilities? So just simple ideas like that. Fundamental shift number 3, change our focus. So I would contend that traditional performance management is about 80% looking back and about 20% looking forward. You agree with me? Yeah. Okay. So I think we need to flip it. If performance management was about 80% looking forward and 20% looking back, understanding what have we learned in the past month, quarter, year, 6 years, whatever it is, what have we learned that is going to help us succeed more as we go forward? What are the strengths of your employees that can help them move forward? What are the things they're excited about, that the best work that they did, you can provide them more opportunities to do that going forward? How do you really learn from that past enough to really have a robust conversation about where you're going? I'm telling you, if you flip that around, the nature of those conversations with employees has a completely different feel to it. Completely different feel. They will engage in that process. They'll be excited about it. Really a great way to sort of shift that focus. So one of the things that we think about in doing this is really shifting from a heavy focus on performance feedback and creating more balance between performance feedback and growth feedback. Now, honestly, I keep thinking I need to redo this slide because I actually think growth should be heavier. And why I think growth should be heavier is because the data that's coming out, so I4CP and CEO just did a huge study that's looking at a lot of these practices in modern performance management. And what they learned is the number one driver of performance is growth-based conversations, development-based conversations frequently occurring with your employees. If you want to drive engagement, if you want to drive performance, that's the secret. Figure out how you're going to make that happen. So you still need some performance conversation. You still need to set goals. You still need to understand how do we do against those goals and compare that. That's part of your strategic alignment, part of that work. But it's I4CP, Institute for Corporate Performance, and CEO. It came out like 3 months ago or something. I can try to find the link and send you the link to it. Yeah. It's really powerful. And it looked at nonprofit organizations, like using Glassdoor and some results from there, and it really was very robust in the way they looked at the data. So that's a key shift. If we can really start to think about how we drive those growth and development-based conversations within the organization, there's a ton of power in that. This is my favorite of the fundamental shifts: abandon uniformity. So when I first started doing this work, what I realized is the craziness of it is, at the time, what we found was 95% of organizations in the US, this was like in 2013, and 90% of organizations globally were using a traditional performance management process. Pretty much the same. And I could walk into almost any client and say, here's what you're doing. They'd say, yes, that's what we're doing. Yet, whenever I talk to a new organization, they'll spend the first 15 minutes telling me what's unique about them: their culture, their people, their history, their legacy, all those types of things. So I always kept trying to reconcile that. If you're all unique, why are you doing the exact same thing? It's craziness. Do you really think that, like, Nordstrom's performance strategy process should be the same as Walmart's? Probably not. Their people strategy is different. The way that they're hiring and circulating talent is completely different. So how do they start to think about the uniquenesses of those different organizations when they're doing their design? So that's level one of abandoned uniformity, is that every organization, in my feeling, should have something that really reflects their own culture, their own strategy, their own people. But then there's a layer below that that says, within your organization, can you abandon uniformity? One size does not fit all when it comes to performance management. If you've got a scientist in San Francisco and a manufacturing employee in China, do you think the same performance management processes suit both? Probably not. And so we need to start to get more comfortable thinking about the segmentation and the needs of our employees within the organization and designing solutions that fit that. And then you get back down to the employee level. Well, what is it that the employee wants? When I first wrote the book, I wrote a section on the difference between my daughter, who's now 23, and my father, who's a 74-year-old CEO, and what they both want in their performance management being very different. It got cut from the book, even though I loved the whole section. But I think the point still is relevant, that my daughter needs constant feedback. She needs to understand what's expected of her, how she grows. She's a millennial. She's trying to figure this stuff out. My father, once in a while you might give him a tip, but you're not going to give him a lot of advice at this point in his career unless he's seeking it. So you really need to start to think about also what can you give, that goes back to the next one, the power to the employees to decide how they want to engage in this process. In my own organization, I have one of my guys who's been with me for almost 9 years. He doesn't want us to talk to him about any of this. He used to be a CHRO. He's done all this work. He just loves to do project work. He doesn't want a leadership role in the organization. His whole view is, tell me once a year what my salary is and leave me alone. And we're like, okay, Brian, go for it, because that's what he wants, where I have other people who are young and want to be talked to all the time. So you really have to think about, how do you let your people sort of figure out how they're going to engage in this process? So on abandoned uniformity, as I mentioned, one of the things to really think about as you start to do this is, what is the employee segmentation within your organization? And how might that segmentation drive different needs, expectations, approaches? Maybe you've got individuals who work on a project-based model, and then you've got, accounts payable that just kind of is doing the same work all the time. Maybe their tools or their methods or their rhythm of their business is different, and you have to kind of think about those things through the process. Fundamental shift number 5, welcome more voices. This is the number one answer to how we drive more fairness and equity into this process. Because if I asked one of you to share with me how this presentation went, that would be an interesting data point. But if I asked all of you, that would be a lot more interesting. I would be able to gather kind of what the real essence of the outcome was. And the more that we can involve people, and I'm a huge fan of peer-based feedback, the more that we can engage people to really be talking to each other and helping each other grow, that's really, really important. And I was telling the group this morning, this whole idea of feedback and being able to talk to each other is like, it's the thing. Like, if we can figure this out, like, you go back to this development-based feedback, if we can figure out how to each help each other in a safe way where we don't fear that feedback, there's a ton of power for that. So I'm actually writing another book called Feedback and Other Dirty Words that we're trying to crack that nut. How do we help each other in a way that feels trusted, that's a conversation that's growth-based, that can really help all of us kind of improve, because we're all a work in process. So in welcoming more voices, really think about what is that coaching culture that you can create in your organization. And it may come in different ways. You may have capability communities who can help people. You may have different other groups of interests. You may have team-based models that teams can help each other. What are the different ways that you can set up conversation that helps all of us grow and think about the work that we're doing and continue to perform better? Fundamental shift 6, stop policing and start empowering. So what this is really getting at is that performance management should not be, you shouldn't anchor your performance management on how are we going to exit our non-performers. That's not what this process is about. When you go back to thinking about develop people, reward equitably, drive organization performance, that's what it's about. So if you've got performance issues, you need to deal with those, but I recommend that being a separate process, a very clean process, one that is, captured in a way that you're able to really track it and it's defensible when you need it. Now, I've actually spoken in legal conferences because, you know what? Lawyers hate performance management. And have you guys ever experienced this, where you go through your annual review, everybody looks fine, 2 months later, a manager's standing in your door and saying, hey, Betty Lou's got to go. And you're like, what? Betty Lou was rated a 3.5. No, but look at the review. You see between lines 6 and 7, I was inferring where she wasn't really struggling, right? So that's the problem we frequently have, is that the performance reviews are so poorly written that they usually are more defendable for the employee than they are for the organization. So it's really better to pull this apart. And frankly, a lot of organizations are going towards a lot less of anything being written. So you probably want to make sure that if you have issues, you're capturing that in a different way. Not surprisingly, the flip to fundamental flaw number 7 is shift number 7, incent collaboration. And really start to think about, if you don't want that competition, if you really want teamwork, if you really want innovation, if you want people to feel like they're thriving together, then you have to come up with ways to help them set shared goals and incentives that drive that type of collaboration. So we're seeing a lot more organizations moving away from just pure goals to the individual, but a lot more team-based kind of priorities and focus that helps unite people around common goals. So this pretty much says that, but really increase the focus on teams and think about how do you connect teams across your organization. How do you help open up that dialogue? How do you help them understand what each other are doing? Yeah. Many. Mm-hmm.
So have you seen, when you especially try to implement that concept, has it ever had the opposite effect where people feel like they're being penalized by other people's performance?
It's a good question. So, and I'm going to talk a minute, the next one is about rewards. I think you have to think really carefully around rewards and how do you still reward those top performers. The gaming company I've been working with, they really went all in, and they set their annual bonus program as just a flat bonus for all employees. And there used to be some differentiation based on performance. And they had some people, very few, but a few came back and said, hey, I was always in the top performance, now I'm not. But now what they're looking is other ways to incent those people to ensure that they're still getting recognized for the work that they're doing, but also still driving this idea that, hey, if we perform as a team, we all, work together in that, and trying to drive much more of that team-based model. So you have to really, it's not, it takes some thinking. You have to kind of really think through it. All right, so, and as I said, so get real with rewards. So I really say let's shift our idea from pay for performance to this idea of pay for capabilities and reward for contributions. Let me say that again. Pay for capabilities, reward for contributions. So here's what we do. When we hire people, we look at that job, we compare it to the market, and we bring that person in based on market-based pay, right? And we all have in our organizations usually some philosophy about where we are in the band for market-based pay. That's great. That's where you want to start. Then what we do is year over year, we start to sort of bastardize that whole number with merit and different things. So someone has a great year, so they get a big bonus. And then the next year, they have a bad year, and they're overpaid. And it starts to get very complex. What would be far easier is if we said, hey, we're going to create a market-based pay model, And we can even be transparent with that. We can tell our employees, this is what our bands are, or even one organization I worked with just set a number for these different levels within the organization. This is what the pay is for those levels. If you want to increase, here's how you increase your capabilities. And if we have that job, we'd love to move you into that next job, and that would mean you'd get paid this. That's a pay for capability model. Set that aside, then you have to say, well, what does contribution look like in our organization? Which kind of goes back to your question. How do we really want to recognize and reward contribution? And have it be flexible so it can flex with the person that has the great year one year and maybe because a personal situation didn't have a great year the next year. You reward them for that work. That can be a lot of different ways that you can look at that. Again, it's complex, but if you start to pull it apart and make it as transparent as possible so the employees can start to take ownership of it, again, a ton of power in that process. So what we've really worked with organizations on is starting to really think about what we call a portfolio of rewards. How do you start to pull this apart and think about maybe the base pay versus equity versus experiences? You really got to think about experiences as part of your total rewards program, because a lot of people, that's what they're looking for. They're going to organizations because they want to have an opportunity to work in Europe. They want to have an opportunity to do that kind of project that's super sexy. They want to work with that type of technology. So thinking about that in the portfolio, and then recognition. How do you start to drive a lot more recognition within your organization? And honestly, micro recognition is where the power is. Small bits of frequent recognition, particularly peer-based, super powerful. So if you can start to think about how you create a portfolio of rewards that's connected to your strategy, that's connected to your employee experiences, that's connected to your culture, can be a great way to think about this. Okay, few other thoughts on rewards is change your timing or the rhythm of, if you're trying to really relook at this, one thing to think about to start to break it up is to think about the timing. So some organizations, many still do this annual cycle where everyone gets a raise at one time. If you're going to redesign it, sometimes it's best to start to bust that apart. Maybe do an anniversary based or quarterly by waves of people. So it's a way to start to break it up. Again, I mentioned a stronger culture of recognition. How do you really build that into the organization? How do you recognize people? How do you tie that to maybe your values or your culture or your strategic goals? And then spend the time to really learn what people think. What is it that people want? The reason I put this here is when we've been doing our work, what we find is the employees are frankly a lot more real about rewards than usually the HR team is and the executives. We did a reboot for a large healthcare system on the East Coast. And we had a team of about 12 people that represented a really diverse group of people and included in it the head of Total Rewards. And there was one point where we were in this discussion about how do we start to pull this apart, and the head of Total Rewards kept wanting to go back to these traditional models. And I honestly thought we were going to have like mutiny on our hands, because the rest of the group in the room was just like, stop, it's ridiculous. We know that it's like, it's small increases, it's driven by these things, let's just be real with what it is. And I'm finding that experience happens a lot where the employees are like, let's just be real, let's just talk about it and how it works and what it means. And that just starts to break sort of this mystery that we frequently have, or the way that people are perceiving inequity in the way that we're rewarding people. All right, so let's talk about redesign and reboot. So I've talked about the flaws, the shifts. Now the next piece is, so how do you go forward? So if you're one of that 70% of people are still looking to move forward to some kind of modern approach, hopefully this might help. And I would always say be true to a few core ideas. Number one is avoid the knotted solution. What I mean by that is what we've done with traditional performance management is we've tried to put all of it into this one process. We're trying to accomplish all three of those goals with one process. If we can start to pull it apart and think about what is it we're trying to accomplish and what mechanisms would we use to do that, it might be multiple processes. It may be a conversation that is around goals is different from the conversation around development. You may disconnect pay from that development conversation. There's a lot of ways you can start to pull this apart that untangles it and makes it a lot more understandable for your employees and a lot easier for you all to manage. The other thing I will always say is go back to those three fundamental goals. And one of the first projects we did was for REI. And so we came up with this idea of the bike, and it sort of stuck with us. And it's the thing that we're all kind of riding our own bike. If you look across those 3 goals, like I said up front, we all share those 3 goals. But the importance or the priority of them will be different organization to organization. Maybe you just went through some transformation, so really driving organizational performance is important. Maybe you're in a battle for talent in the market, and so you really want to put focus on develop people and reward equitably. There's different ways you might tilt it based on what's happening in your own organization. But remember, what's important is you have to kind of get clear on that and build alignment among your leaders, among your managers, of what it is that is important to your organization. And then that sets you up to be able to really design the right solution for you. Now, I'm a consultant, so we always have a 5-step process. It's a rule. We signed a form, said we'd always have a 5-step process. Ours is, but you see our language is a little bit different. We talk about mobilize, sketch, configure, then build and implement. And the reason our language is a little bit different is that sketch is really about that triangle, understanding how you're leaning against those 3 common goals and what's important to you, and getting clear on what the design principles are for your organization. And then configure, the reason we use that language is because it really is saying, look, there's a number of different mechanisms you're going to kind of assemble together to create that experience for your employee and for your managers. So it's not just one solution, it's a configuration of different ideas that you're going to bring together. And then build and implement, that's pretty straightforward. First thing I would say, if you're going to start this, is start with your leaders. We always say leaders go first. And so remember, that was number 3 is the reasons why people weren't going forward is because maybe their leaders weren't ready for this. You really need to educate them. And sometimes it's a little scary to tell your CEO or your CFO that they may not know everything. But you really have to get some time to make sure that they understand what's not working, what is working, what your people are looking for, and take the time with that. So there's a story of we didn't work with them on this process, we just did a little bit of advisory work, and there was a CHRO who had decided she was going to have her HR team design a new process for them. And she set them off on their way, she picked some of her top people, they designed this solution that she was super excited about. She set time on the executive agenda to have her team share the design with the executives. They went in, they presented. Her name's Chris, the CHR. She was so excited. At the end of the presentation, she started clapping, and then she looked around the room and realized no one else on the executive team was clapping. And the CEO literally turned to her and said, "Chris, why are you clapping?" And the problem was she hadn't brought them forward. They didn't even understand why they were having this conversation. They didn't understand why they needed a new performance management process. So she luckily got them there later, but she had to back up and really spend time with the leaders to bring them forward so they were advocates and supporters in the process as you went forward. You've got to start with the leaders. Invite the right people to the conversation. When we do this work, we think as many voices as you can have in the design, the better. You want those people who are really strong managers who are probably doing a lot of things right now despite the system that they're working in. You want the naysayers who will say this will never work. You want that total rewards person in the room. You want to make sure that those people have a voice and are participating in this so when you're ready to move forward, you've got that momentum and some support with you. Align on the design principles. I've mentioned this a few times, but these are sort of your North Star. This is really getting clear on what is it we're designing for. What is the experience we want our employees to have? How do we want this process to support our strategy? What do we want the whole process to feel like for our managers? How is it going to connect to our culture? All those types of things. You really want to take the time to think about what the design principles are. And we have a little shortcut for you that can help you get started. That at our site, there's a thing called the sketchbook. And the sketchbook is super easy. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes to complete. What it does is it asks you in this step 1, it asks you a set of 12 questions around your current process. Those are anchored in the 3 common goals. Then what it does is it gives you a set of 19 design principles that we wrote. I always say they're the canned design principles. In the end, I hope yours are completely unique and in your own language, but this helps you get a fast start. You have to pick 6 of the 19 design principles that are important to you. And then you click that little generate my frame, and it will actually draw your pyramid of where you're leaning between develop people, reward equitably, and drive organizational performance. So you can go out today and take it yourself and sort of see what it means. We use this tool, when I talked about inviting more voices, we use this tool to engage sometimes whole organizations, sometimes representation across an organization. And what's interesting is it gives you the top design principles that your people have energy around, and it sort of shows you the differences across the organization. Not surprisingly, I'll tell you, 9 times out of 10, the executives lean in a different direction than the rest of the organization. And that's just good to know. And this is not an answer, but this tells you where to start the conversation. What are the things we need to explore? What are the conversations we need to have about what our design principles are, what's important to us around the 3 common goals? Then the configure. So our configuration has 6 categories: goals and alignment, feedback and performance insights, coaching and mentoring, career development and planning, talent reviews and insights, and total rewards. Now, don't try to leave total rewards out. People try, it never works. You have to include all 6 of these elements to really design a holistic solution that's going to replace your traditional model. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have a lot of heavy stuff happening in all these categories, but you need to kind of think about all of them. Yeah?
Can you use the total rewards terminology? We don't use that in our company.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just give like a quick definition of just the entire compensation strategy?
Yeah, and it usually includes benefits and bonus and comp and anything that is sort of seen as a value driver for your employees. Yeah. Okay. The one thing I'll say around goals and alignment, interesting trend that I'm seeing, and there's actually starting to be more published around, that SMART goals maybe aren't as smart as we all thought they were. A lot of my clients are starting to move more towards priorities rather than talking about goals, and having them be much more flexible and agile, because the world moves so fast. It's a lot more about what are we working on this month, what are we working on this week, like a lot more agile in the way that we're thinking about goals and alignment. And then feedback, again, we're seeing a lot more around peer-based feedback, open, multi-rater, multi-voice kind of stuff happening in there. And I'm a huge fan of talent reviews, but when they really put the employee at the center of that experience. How do we talk about our people? How do we spend time really kind of assessing our talent and thinking about how we are going to grow those people in a way that it's meaningful to them? So there's a lot of things that you can play with here that's important. So I will ask you to ponder this for the rest of the day. It's sort of, as you're going back to your organizations, what's the role you want to play if you're thinking about moving forward to a more modern approach to performance management? Think about that and how hopefully some of this might help you. And my final thoughts here are, not surprisingly, I would tell you there is no one right answer, because of course abandoned uniformity is at the heart of this. But there's some bad ones, so try to avoid the bad ones. The best design for you won't be the best design for the other guys. Again, you have to really make sure this reflects who you are and what's important to your organization. And the solutions, the good news is the solutions are often way more simple. They're a lot less complex. They're a lot less documentation and policing heavy. But getting there rarely is, because it's a huge shift. It means letting go of processes and ideas that we all grew up with and moving to something that's really different and trusting that that's going to work. And that's a struggle. That's a change that makes this all very hard. And trust me, I've watched a lot of organizations kind of work their way through that process. So I am happy to open it up to more questions. It looks like I have about 10 minutes or so. Yeah. My thoughts on 9-boxing. I think the challenge with 9-boxing is you get, again, into really dumping people in these 3x3, kind of buckets. I actually prefer a conversation that really is more simple. And sometimes we'll use, kind of literally that, like, who are your superstar performers? Who are the people that you are struggling to figure out what to do with? And that's the conversation. And then really thinking about all those people in the middle. How do you start to help them grow, and what are the tools that they need to grow? So 9-box often happens in talent reviews, and so I love if talent reviews are happening, but I'd rather the conversation just be more about the people and less about trying to argue over, well, Bob's in that bucket and Bill's in that one, and I'm not sure that's the right buckets. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Our whole approach at our company is kind of evolving right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of times decided in the past, but it's almost that point where, oh, it's time to do the reviews again.
Mm-hmm.
Just do it the old way. If you have people who are intimidated by saying like, wow, this will never work at our company, based on your experience with companies, what would you say would be the ideal time frame? So if someone came to you and said, we have 150 employees, how long will it take to redo the performance process? What would you say, like at least 18 months or 3 years, or what?
Yeah,
Timeframe?
yeah, that's a really good question. So here's what I'll tell you. For like a company for 150 people, you could probably do a design in 6 weeks. Easy. That was inclusive and thoughtful and all that. Bigger companies, designs usually take like 12 weeks. And that's kind of my mobilize, sketch, configure, 3 steps. Once you've got that done, implementation can range from 3 months to 3 years. And it really depends on what the solution is. So I know when I was talking to the Clear Company people, they were talking about the competency models that's in the tool set. And what we're finding, and there's a ton of power to build a real strong competency, or I like to call them capabilities, because competency's kind of got a bad brand, but capability model that exposes for your people, what are the skills I need to progress? So that type of work takes more time, because it really means you have to define those jobs. If you don't have a job framework, you probably need to do that work. So that's the type of stuff that will take longer. But I would say the core of the process, which is around conversations, hopefully more frequent, more development-based conversations, you can implement that almost immediately. The key thing you need to focus on there is making sure your people are ready for that conversation. And oftentimes that might be some training around feedback or some different things of like teaching people, how do I have a career conversation, right? And that's more the work that happens. So like I said, a lot of the solutions are more simple. They don't have a lot of paperwork, any of that type of thing. And I really recommend starting really simply and then figuring out how the technology, sort of test ideas and then really bring the technology in to enable those ideas. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so yeah, that was my, hey, we need to exit somebody or we have a performance problem, document away and document in the moment and document clear specifics to that situation. But don't burden your performance management process with that, because that's your exception. And what you really want your performance management process to be doing is focused on your high performers. We spend way too much time oftentimes dealing with our non-performers and forget our top performers. And then they leave, and then we go, oh, darn, they left. So if we could just really kind of clean that up and make sure that whatever our process is for dealing with people who are struggling, and there's a lot even going on in that arena about a lot more transparency and sort of asking people to leave, in a way that's a lot more transparent and say, hey, this isn't working for you, this isn't working for us. How do we create a process that helps you move to the next job? So dealing with that in its own way. But when it comes to the actual performance process, what we've found is most managers and employees want minimal documentation just to remember what they agreed to or sort of what the agenda was that they talked about. So if they're talking monthly or weekly or whatever, they might just jot a couple of bullets that say, hey, we talked about this, we talked about that. That's really it. In the end, you don't need a lot more because it's really about the conversation. It's about what comes out of that conversation, and it's not about the documentation. And so if we can swap out all that time people spent writing and translate that into time people spend talking, whew, I can't tell you how powerful that is. I mean, it's so amazing to me how simple it is, but yet how much we struggle to get there. We did that same medical system we were talking to. One of my most favorite moments was one of the women that was in the group was the head of, she was a lead nurse. And I don't know if any of you come from healthcare, but in nursing, they have these huge spans of control. She had something like 75 nurses that reported to her. And she had a 12-page form she had to fill out for each one of them related to their performance review. And for that client, what we designed was a 1-page summary that had sort of quarter-to-quarter updates. It was like 1 page, a couple of bullets under each box. And we were sitting there in the meeting, and I was watching Lori's face, and I had to stop. And I was like, Lori, what's going on? It feels like you're having a little moment over there. And she said, Tamra, I'm just sitting here imagining my life not having to fill out 75 12-page documents and how much time that's going to free up for me to do other things. So I think if we can really kind of move to something that is far easier and far more employee-centered, tons of power. What else?
Yeah, I'm just curious, what's your opinion on, like, I guess, for actual performance issues that are maybe off cycle to the whole review process, you know? Like, what's your opinion on, like, verbal warnings, written warnings, that kind of sequence?
Yeah, so the question is, what's my opinion on performance issues and that? So again, I think that immediate feedback is very important. I think if it's an issue you think is heading towards potentially an exit for an employee, I do think you need to record that so you have stuff that is recorded and is very transparent to the employee that this is where we are. I am not a fan of performance improvement plans because most of the time that's just a way to delay someone's exit. And oftentimes we put someone on a PIP knowing that we're going to exit them in 3 months and just drag them through the mud until we get there. So if that's where you're at, I would rather have a much more grown-up conversation with that employee about this isn't working, and can I invite you to leave, and how can I help you find your next position? And I don't know about if you've had those experiences, but I've had those experiences where the person in the end thanks me. Yeah. Like, thank you so much for help. I've been struggling, I've been in pain, right? So I think if we just can have those mature conversations, it's so much better for everybody. Yeah. Yeah. Peer feedback. I think anything that's anonymous is gamed. It's weaponized. And what you really want to try to do is create confidence and muscle in being able to have a conversation with somebody. And honestly, a lot of that feedback should be positive, right? It should be like, hey, I saw you do that presentation, it was killer. And here's what I thought you did really well. What we've been trying to do is train a lot of organizations to just what we call the simple art of noticing. And so to build a rapport with your peers, to rebuild a rapport with your manager, with your subordinates, that just says, hey, I'm noticing this stuff every day, and most of the time it's positive, and once in a while I'm going to tell you something that's just going to help you do better the next time. And that just creates this feeling of trust and ability to go forward, right? So, hey, I noticed in that presentation you lost the audience. And I think you lost the audience because the slides seemed a little complex to me. What do you think? And then you're having a conversation about that that's helping them think through it next time, but it doesn't hurt. It's like, oh, yeah, I can simplify that. Like, then you move on, right? My theory is on feedback in general, this annual review has been a big bugaboo about it, because what we've done is we've created this weird definition of feedback, which is, I'm going to put you in this room and I'm going to dump a whole bunch of crap on you, and I'm going to tell you a bunch of good stuff, and then I'm going to tell you the bad stuff, and then we're going to do it again in a year. And so everybody has this like fear of this process because it's just painful and horrible. And this was sort of my own, I'm just riffing now, this was sort of my own epiphany, because I'm the type of person that I'm constantly telling people I work with, hey, try this or do that or whatever. And they'll say to me, oh, Tamra, we haven't had a feedback session. I'll say, yes, we have. I've been giving you feedback every day, almost every time we're together. It's just not this big, heavy, loaded, painful, we sat in a room and stared at each other in an uncomfortable way for an hour. Right? So I think we just really need to redefine that in a way that is safe, and we can trust each other and know that our definition of feedback is it's trying to help somebody improve. And if it's not there, if it's for any other reason, keep it to yourself, right?
I know we're running out of time. I just wanted to know, when you talk about determining rewards without ratings,
Yep.
I know everything is custom to your clients.
Right.
Yeah,
so again, so remember the idea of capabilities versus contributions. So I think there's a nugget in there. So part of the work that we've been doing with a lot of our clients is getting really clear on the capability pay. So what is my job frameworks? What are the jobs I have? How are they marketed against, pay in the market? And what are the capabilities that an employee needs to demonstrate to say you're there? That cleans that up a lot. And when it's documented, then you can sit down with an employee and say, I know you want that pay, but you haven't been able to demonstrate these capabilities yet. but how do I help you do that? How do I help you build that skill, that confidence, whatever? That's one conversation. Then I think on the contribution, it has to be a lot more, again, about what the culture is. So I can share with you, like at People Firm, what we do is we have, because we're small enough, we're kind of in your 150 range, we're small. We actually have this thing called People Firm Bucks that, don't tell my tax accountant, but we just literally give cash to our people. And we say, your only mission is to use that money to recognize your peers. And at the end of the we do it every half year. At the end of the half year, you need to tell us where that money went. And gosh, along the way, if you'll actually tell us what you're recognizing your peers for, and if we can share that with the tribe, that's great. So that's what we do for kind of a recognition. Now, there's a lot more, achievers and different tools that do that you can do in a much more systematic kind of way. And then we also do try to do a bonus that is based on the performance of the organization, but we do peer-based feedback. So we will say, we'll do a whole thing and say, hey, who this past quarter or whatever just really drove the performance of this company? And it's interesting to us that most of the time, the feedback we get from the tribe is the same as what we thought, but it just validates our thinking. And then we kind of segment sort of levels of participation in the bonus based on that. So I think you really have to, every organization is different and kind of think about what works for yours and your culture. Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, how do you hold managers accountable? So that goes back to can we trust our managers, barrier number 2. What a lot of our organizations are doing is actually surveying. So you do frequent surveys of the employee base to just check in. Are you having frequent conversations? Are those valuable? Is your manager helping you grow your career? You can just ask 2 or 3 questions and really kind of get a sense of where you are. If you also are already doing engagement work, oftentimes there's questions in your engagement survey which will point to that as well. And we are seeing, when the clients that we're working with, we are seeing the engagement numbers tick up when it comes to putting in these processes that are a lot more human-centered. Okay, I think I'm officially out of time. Thank you, guys. I'm going to be around for lunch, and I'm going to come back for some of the later sessions this afternoon. So if any of you want to talk to me or have other questions, feel free to grab me. Thank you.